Imamo prilike ugostiti jednog iskusnog čovjeka koji je radio puno u migracijama javne uprave. Ima iskustva i na tu temu je napisao knjigu. Vani imate knjigu na raspolaganju za pogledat kao ogledni primjerak. Ko hoće može knjigu kupiti, a doznao sam sinoć još jednu novu informaciju da će ta knjiga u dogovoru sa izdavačem kroz 9 mjeseci čini mi se izaći kao Creative Commons knjiga koja će se može besplatno i legalno downloadati. I'm very proud to present Mr. Brian Fitzgerald. He will talk about lessons learned from adopting open source in several countries. He wrote a book about that, and here is Brian Fitzgerald.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. So I'm very pleased to be here. I've been in Croatia 2 or 3 times before, but never for work or a conference like this. So I hope you can understand my brand of English. I will try to go slowly, but most of it's on the slide. And as Ivan said, there is a book about this. So this is very practical. At this stage, the challenges in open source adoption are not technical ones. Those have been overcome, I would say. It's now much more socio-organizational, personal kinds of challenges need to be overcome. So this talk is about some lessons learned over the past 10 years or so of open source adoption, what worked well and what didn't work well across several countries. And there is a clear thread. I think it's quite obvious, but there are things that possibly would not be obvious. So it's very useful for, I think, to ensure success of open source adoption. It shouldn't fail for socio-organizational reasons at this stage. So some background. Well, I've been involved in open source software for a long time, I guess about 15 years or so, but the early open source implementations were in back office invisible infrastructure. So it just worked very well, and the people who deployed these solutions were tech savvy, I guess, which meant they were technically aware, technically knowledgeable. So they things like Linux worked very well, or Apache as a web server, or Samba for file and print services. They just worked very well, and the technically aware knew that, and they just deployed them, and it really was easy because in most cases it was a free download if you could configure it, so there wasn't any budget approval necessary. So a lot of implementation happened under the radar. A good example, or a funny story about this, I think, is Karim Lakhani, who's at MIT, did a very large survey of open source adoption about 10 years ago or so, maybe a little more, around 2000. And they asked a lot of companies, particularly in the US, it was mostly North American respondents, but a lot of companies to that survey responded saying they would not consider using open source software in their organizations. It was just not possible, they wouldn't consider it. But the survey response came back through an Apache web server, so they didn't even know that there was open source software in their organizations. And I think that was quite common. A lot of organizations didn't know how much of it was there under the radar in the early days. And it just worked very well. Life didn't fall apart. Then, well, now that's changed. It's ubiquitous. Open source software is everywhere. In almost any domain you can mention, there are very viable open source products that can meet the needs of that domain. So it's interesting, so it's very much visible front office applications now, so much more high profile, much more high risk, you could say as well, because it's more obvious that their open source software is running the show. In the past it wasn't obvious, it was under the radar, people didn't see it, didn't interact with it, and didn't know it was there, it just worked. The interesting thing, I think, is open source software has certainly gone beyond the software domain. So, like, it is an example of global software development. Most organizations today want to practice global software development because of, for many reasons, innovation, cost control, and so on. It's very difficult, yet open source software has worked for 20 odd years or so, or longer, I guess, as a model, as an exemplar of successful global software development. People globally can work on developing software and coordinate efficiently. So it's extremely successful in that domain, but it's also the reason why the software engineering conferences are much less interested in open source software now. It's much more, it's spread to management or organizational theory more generally, or sociology, psychology, lots of other domains, law, are interested in the open source model. So as a new mode of organizing, so crowdsourcing or open data, I guess, which is the subject of a talk earlier, those things we know work because of open source software, because the success of open source software means that people are confident that the open source model works. So things like crowdsourcing, NASA, the American Space Agency, now do a lot of software engineering in a crowdsourcing mode. Problems they can't solve, they hand out to the crowd to solve. And that's very different to what was the case in the past. So to military and beyond, there's a Buzz Lightyear in the Toy Story movies, you talk about to infinity and beyond. To military and beyond is miloss.org is something I came across recently. So this was a cartoon about 1996, 97 or something. I used to show it to students to get a laugh, basically, a cheap laugh at lectures. So it was never real anyway, but the idea was it was kind of an equation of open source with communism. I think that was part of the rhetoric or part of the rationale behind companies in North America when Karim Lakhani was doing his survey saying, well, we wouldn't dream of using open source software in this organization. It's part of the reason why the term open source software was chosen over free software, because free software was seen as having a label that commerce, particularly in the US, or commercial enterprises would shy away from because it was seen as zero cost rather than free as in liberty. So a lot of resistance, or a lot of suspicion of open source as that was communistic in tone. So, but recently I came across this, the military open source software, which is a US initiative. And the US has always been very strong in open source software, and VISTA, the Vietnam Veterans Hospital Information System, was mentioned earlier. But now the rhetoric is about that open source is okay. It's for, you can see here what I've highlighted, diverse patriots can use open source software to effectively defend our nation. So it's come a long way from being seen as open source as a communist kind of anti-enterprise, anti-patriotic or anti-American way to now being, well, this is the way we will harness innovation to defend our nation. So things have changed dramatically in the past 15 years or so. So on to the talk. So what I'm going to talk about is it's lessons based on 5 cases of open source adoption. So that's across 4 countries, Ireland, Italy, 2 examples of open source adoption in Italy, Spain and the United States. All the examples are in the local government public sector, which I think that's a sector I guess is relevant here for this conference. And it's by no means universally successful. There have been successes and failures, and the failures have not generally been for technical reasons. They've been for other reasons organizationally. So what I want to do today is just go through a framework of factors we synthesized a framework to look at, well, what worked well in these cases, what didn't work well, and why. So that's what I'm going to present for the next 20, 30 minutes or so. Well, firstly, I suppose just the reasons why one would adopt open source software, or organizations or public sector would do this. The first reason, quite obvious, and one of the early reasons, was that to reduce costs. And there's a good quote here behind me from John Madog Hall that it's not about the cost, it's about the value. That's a really good quote, because those who sought to reduce costs as purely a cost reduction exercise, the expectations were too great, and TCO is total cost of ownership. And that's really, well, it's a complex area. You can find studies show you what you want, basically, around open source software. You can find studies that show open source software costs more than proprietary software, costs less than proprietary software, and costs about the same. So it depends on what you measure. There's no really good definitive definition or how you take that into account. And total cost of ownership is not, so cost is not, it is, I do believe cost reduction is possible. Certainly in the long run, cost reduction is possible with open source software. People do that. But if cost is the only driver, then people's expectations or organization expectations can be too high. A more pressing need as well, or reason, is reducing vendor lock-in. So it's really about open data, I guess, when the earlier talks about that, I imagine, that you don't want to be Like there are versions of Microsoft, for example, that Microsoft Office today doesn't open older formats, so you're very much a prisoner if you've got data in a format that's proprietary, that it may not survive. And lots of companies, automobile companies are doing this now, various companies, telecommunications companies, trying to stimulate hobbyists and communities to support software, because that's likely to have longevity beyond the company. Lots of technology companies disappear after less than 10 years. So reducing vendor lock-in is a major issue to have openness in the long run. Also, I think you have more control or more ability to adapt to local needs. That can happen with open source software because you have access to the source code. We studied a very nice example of this actually a few years ago, where a network of small open source companies, SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, we called them open source service networks. There are a few of these around, but in one case they were competing with IBM for a project, and everyone thought, IBM will win this because IBM have a lot of marketing might and a lot of reputation. But the open source service network won the project. It was a fairly big project, and the open source service network was a cluster of small open source companies. And they won the project because they convinced the client that they could offer the whole product, if you like, to the company, to the client company, using Jeffrey Moore's term, that they could offer a really distinct, tailored product. The company would get that if they went with the open source service network. They wouldn't necessarily get that with a large corporation like IBM. So they were able to they could ensure or reassure the client that they would have direct access to the developers who had done various pieces of the code, so they could have a very tailored solution. So I think that's part of it, that if you have access to the source code, if you've got an ecosystem with your local software suppliers, then you're likely to be able to adapt the code to local needs. Translation, I think, is a good example. Open source products often were way ahead of proprietary versions in localization and translation to local needs. Also, more transparency and security through openness. So this is a kind of paradox that many companies or many proprietary companies argue that open source is inherently vulnerable to security because it's open and hackers can see, or malicious individuals can see the code and could see ways to undermine it. But its openness is also, all the examples show that the openness is better, in fact, because then you can also see how to fix it more quickly. So there have been lots of examples of viruses which have begun and have been solved in Australia and New Zealand before the US or Europe wake up, because they're detected and solved more quickly. So there is more, the transparency, I think, does give you greater security through openness. I mentioned already the future-proofing, that if you want to ensure backward compatibility to earlier versions of documents and so on, open source is a good way to go, or open data formats are a good way to go. It's also the case, one of the arguments that was made in South America about 10 or 12 years ago, that open source would kill the local software communities. So it would be, the argument was made by proprietary software companies basically, that if open source happened in those countries, the local industry would die off because it would all be open source software coming in for free from abroad, and there'd be no market opportunity for the local software suppliers. That's not true, in fact. The way the open source adoption ecosystem works, it's very, very often the case that a company wants to adopt some open source software. There's a lot of knowledge out there they don't have as to what products work well and so on, and no one is marketing open source software in the same way. So there's a lot of effort to identify what products might be suitable. And that's the role that we have seen software companies, local small software companies provide for I guess I can just cancel this. Sorry. They can usefully provide by going into partnership with the client company, with the public sector companies. So rather than destroying the local software market, open source software can actually provide growth opportunities for local software companies. I think it's better to look at open source something like when governments invest in railroad or road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, or telecommunications infrastructure. It's provided, and then you can grow a business on top of that. And in the same way, I think open source, small software companies can bootstrap a service, a value-added service on top of open source software, which gives them an opportunity wouldn't be there otherwise. So it's very much, it's not about killing the local software industry, it's very much about creating extra opportunities. We have seen that. And then another reason to adopt, some companies just like to be seen as pioneering and innovative. Often public sector government is not seen as pioneering and innovative. So there are companies who like this, want to see themselves in that way, so they will try out new technology such as open source. So there are a number of reasons to adopt. What I want to look at is, after looking at several cases of open source adoption in different countries, we have a framework now for understanding the adoption process and understanding what works well. So basically it's a number of components in this framework. So the first one, and I'll go through the lessons from each in a moment, but managerial intervention is very important. So in any kind of tech, these factors are taken from technology innovation more generally and then tailored for the open source adoption process. So an issue that comes up is whether open source adoption is mandatory or voluntary in an organization. Training and support is an important issue, and the role of championing OSS, so championing open source by management. That's something management need to do. So I'll talk about all these in detail in a moment. A second factor comes under the category of subjective norms, which is a kind of ideological one. And this is far less tangible. So it's about, in an organization, it's about expectations of peers, of your peers at your level, of managers, of subordinates. So it's the kind of ideology. What do they expect and what do they need? In case people are taking notes, by the way, I'm happy to leave this talk here if anyone wants to give copies of the presentation to anyone. So don't feel you need to get all this down. The presentation will be available on the website, I guess. So ideology can be important, how people feel about open source software. Then there are what we call, or what are termed, facilitating conditions. So these are the attributes of the innovation itself, firstly. And I'm going to mention 5 here. These 5 attributes: relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, trialability, observability, image. These have all been identified by Everett Rogers, actually, who for about 40 years or so was the go-to guru on technology innovation. And he, after a lot of studies in a lot of different sectors, came up with this very nice, parsimonious, succinct set of 5 factors. He said these explain successful innovation adoption. So just the way the argument would go is that relative advantage is about, is the new technology better than the existing technology? So if there's an advantage in the new technology relative to the old technology, then people are likely to adopt the new technology. Compatibility is about, well, is it compatible with the way people want to work? So if the new innovative technology doesn't support the way people like to work, then they're less likely to adopt it. If it does support the way they like to work, then they're more likely to adopt it. Complexity is an issue. If something is too complex, people are not likely to learn how to use it, so it's going to delay adoption or inhibit adoption. Trialability is an important thing. If you can try something out easily and see if you like it or not, then you can assess some of the other things like relative advantage and compatibility and so on. So trialability is important. Observability, image. Rogers assumed that new technology, innovative technology, would have a positive image. And his argument was that if you could observe other people using a new technology, then you were more likely to adopt it. You would look at it and you'd say, that looks cool, I should have something like that. So I guess that's how iPhones or things like that, or iPads proliferate. People see other people using an iPad and think, I must have something like that. So observability is an important thing. And these are all factors in open source adoption, no less so, because open source lends itself to many of these things. And then the final category in a facilitating condition is the attributes of the organization itself. So there are 2 things to consider here. The absorptive capacity, which basically is a term which refers to how easily an organization can absorb new knowledge to take advantage of a new technology. So how can they absorb the necessary knowledge, to train the right people to do a deployment of a new technology. And attitude to innovation and risk is important as well. Some organizations, and this is often the case in public sector, are risk averse, so they don't like to try new things. They like to be behind, they like to be behind the curve in trying out new technology and new innovation. So that's a factor as well. If an organization is risk averse, then you need to consider risk management becomes important, how you educate people into mitigating risk, or showing there isn't much risk or as much as they thought. Okay, so those factors, that framework of factors is what we use to analyze the 5 cases and to say, how did they perform on these? And these were the factors that were seen to be best to explain success and failure. So let me talk about mandatory usage. So this is where managerial intervention, that management decide in an organization, usage of open source software is mandatory. You're going to have to use this software, so there's no optionality about it. It must be used. Anything like that, human nature, if you tell something they have to do, tell someone they have to do something, the smoking ban in most countries in Europe, for example, or a lot of resistance to that. When something becomes mandatory, there's a natural resistance. People don't like to be told they must do something. So if you're going to make something mandatory, you really need to expect that there's going to be resistance and be ready to deal with it. The problem is, if you make something mandatory, there are always people who can get out of things. So the problem is that those people are perceived as being the elite, and everyone wants to be the elite. So in two of the cases we looked at, open source adoption was declared to be mandatory in the organizations, but then the first group, the top management, said, well, we won't use it, obviously, it'll be for everyone else, but we don't have the time to learn new technology, so we're going to stick with the old technology because we're so busy, but everyone else should definitely use this technology. So they made it mandatory for everyone lower than them in the organization, and that clearly is a problem, because you can't do that. The other problem was in a hospital where it was made mandatory, and the consultants, who are the most highly paid and most powerful people, I guess, in a hospital, they said, well, we don't really want this new technology. The organization were able to say, well, if you don't move to open source software, we won't support you. Our IT technical support won't be available if you don't go with this new technology. And the consultants group said, well, we've lots of money from research grants, and we don't need your technology support. We'll buy in our own technology support. So, and they did that. And the problem was that again became an elite. It became, well, open source software is what you use if you have no choice, if you're not top management, or if you don't have the resources, you're not a consultant with resources to hire your own technical support. So that's a problem. This is a quote kind of to illustrate this, that in one organization where people were talking about this, said, well, we were all told we had to use open source software, and then you meet people in a corridor and you hear they're still using Microsoft Office, and immediately you ask, how did you manage to do that? So it's seen as this is a kind of thing that you escape from open source adoption. That kind of perception is problematic everywhere. So if you're going to make usage mandatory in an organization, you really must be aware there's going to be natural resistance, and make sure that those who opt out of this aren't perceived as being the elite who have the resources and the power to do otherwise. And that's pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times that becomes a problem. Training and support is a very big issue as well, and it tends to be underestimated, the amount of training and support needed for open source software. It tends to be underestimated for 2 reasons, I think. One, because open source software products in the past have often been identical, or pretty much identical, to proprietary software products. So most people wouldn't know a presentation being done in Impress on OpenOffice versus PowerPoint, or like they look equivalent. So it's not obvious they're different. There are differences, though. They differ quite a bit. So assuming that people can convert to a new technology, if you're implementing a new proprietary technology in an organization and spending, if you're implementing SAP, for example, Enterprise Resource Planning System, you might be spending a few million euro on the software, and you would certainly have a large training budget. If you're not spending a lot of money on the software in the first place, doesn't mean that it's free software, doesn't mean that the training is free. And again, it's a good opportunity. Training is a good opportunity for local software companies to provide the training. So it's quite common in organizations to underestimate, which goes back to the total cost of ownership. They assume, well, we get the software for free pretty much. Well, the training should be free as well, shouldn't it? Or we shouldn't need training. And it really is, they would not do it with a proprietary technology deployment, but it tends to happen quite frequently with open source software adoption. So you really need to understand that training and good training is an opportunity to ensure success later. So it shouldn't be assumed that you don't need a budget for training. Training is a good opportunity to communicate the advantages of open source as well. So that goes to the relative advantage point later. So it's a good opportunity to upskill users because you can provide training which makes people more knowledgeable, which is good for their career development. So it's a really important opportunity. Don't see it, training as a cost that is a necessary evil. See it as an opportunity to upskill users, to create a positive image about the new technology and to show the benefits and the relative advantage of open source. Lead users are very important in this as well. So lead users is a term Eric von Hippel coined, where power users or lead users often in the last 30 years or so know the technology very well and sell it to their peers. So they become the go-to person. Lead users are much better than a technical person because technical people can't often speak business language, whereas the lead user understands, they're part of the user community, so they understand how users need to use the technology and they can explain it much better. So if you can find, in the successful cases we looked at, there were clearly lead user people who were identified who were able to spread the message in the community to the other organizational users deploying the new technology. So in summary, I think training is long-term, so it's going to be multi-phased because you want to train maybe in the early stages and then more complex use of the technology, and it should be tailored to the context. So that probably is one of the key things that people misunderstand, the importance of training in an open source deployment context. Final managerial intervention issue is championing open source. So normally if you buy SAP, you'll get, by Oracle as well, I guess you'll get lots of vendors coming to talk to you about the advantages of the new technology. There is no one sometimes, it makes it difficult to purchase open source because you can't really issue a request for tender because there's not necessarily going to be a vendor out there to respond to your request for tender, for example. So the vendors aren't there playing this marketing role. So you do need someone as senior as possible in the organization to champion open source. And there have been, like, you could name, in the cases, you could name the people, we could all identify and say, that's the champion, that's the senior management person who made this work. Because it created an impression of legitimacy in the organization if this senior person was behind it. So the maxim here is, I guess, eat your own dog food. So if you're a senior manager saying, well, we're going to do open source software in this organization, but I'm not going to do it myself, obviously, then you're not going to succeed because you just haven't eaten your own dog food. You haven't bought into the deployment yourself. So those are three key aspects of the managerial role. The subjective norms this is much less tangible, but it's an important issue. So you would think, I guess many people here are part of the converted. You're already die-hard Linux users, or have a lot of experience with open source software and see it as a good thing. So your image is going to be positive of it. For many people in other sectors, the argument goes like this, that if they're asked to use open source software, they say, well, hang on a minute, that's free software. If I'm using free software, then my work has been devalued. So they kind of, again, in the hospital context, they would look at, well, we buy hugely expensive X-ray systems or radiology systems, and if I'm working that equipment, then I'm a very valuable member of staff because I'm trusted with very expensive equipment and very expensive software. If you're asking me now to do a job with free software, then I'm not as valuable as my colleague in the hospital down the road. So for many people, they see the free, they concentrate on the free and they think this is cheap, my work has been cheapened in some way. And the feeling of being de-skilled, like we had people who said, well, I won't be able to get a job in the future because I now only know open source software, and if I try to convert to another organization, I'm not going to have the skills they're looking for. And that's an easy argument to counter because you've now got an additional set of skills. You had the proprietary skills, now you know open source software, so you're more skilled. But there's a feeling of being de-skilled, a feeling of being undervalued that people can have. It's a reaction that completely surprised me, I have to say, and it surprised a lot of technical people who assume that the image of open source software is a positive go-ahead one. And again, if you're in an organization, you're saying, well, we're going to do this, but you can't point to any other successful exemplar in the same sector. Now, and the ideal thing is if you can point to successful exemplars in the same country. Like if lots of things that happen in America or something, people think, well, that could happen there, but it couldn't happen here. Whereas if you can, so having a successful exemplar as a role model is hugely important to get other people to try it. And sometimes the initial exemplar might be successful, but all the organizations influence subsequently might be more successful because they don't make the same mistakes. So a kind of quote here to show this, that people don't necessarily see open source software as good. We didn't think open office was given to us as a bonus. We thought Microsoft Office had been taken away. So the idea again of disempowerment, of disenfranchising people. Relative advantage, so moving on to the attributes of the innovation. So relative advantage is extremely important. You have to create and it's not difficult, it's possible, because open source software it's newer than lots of proprietary products. It has new features, new innovative features that make it better, in fact. But you need to illustrate this. So training, that's why training again is so important, that you illustrate the advantages of open source software. So in the old days, for example, OpenOffice could create PDF, which people found very useful. Or it could open old Microsoft Office formats that the current version of Microsoft Office couldn't open. So there were those kinds of avoiding lock-in issues. In the Spanish case, there was a version of Linux configured, created especially for Spain, Extremadura in Spain. They created a word processing system. Espronceda, I guess, is a Spanish writer from the 18th century, I think. So it was very much tailored to their context. People could look at it and be proud of the technology and see it as indigenous Spanish. Again, part of the advantage, people would see this as being closer, more familiar, not from a completely different country. I think it's less problematic. In the cases where we saw people putting in new technology, e-learning maybe, for example, or email where it hadn't been before, where you're putting in a technology where there was no incumbent, where there's no existing technology to compare it with, well then obviously the relative advantage is very high because you've got relative advantage of you're comparing to nothing that was gone before. So that was less problematic in new areas. And another thing we found very useful was that if people could use the technology at home, some organizations have bizarre policies about not letting people use technology at home that exists in the workplace. If you allow them to use it at home, it had many benefits. One, they were able to get more time to learn to use the technology. Two, they were able to use it with their families, and families could use it, so it was seen as a benefit. So this all was part of, these are the kinds of things you need to do to try make this better than what's gone before. And it's very important to try to create that. I don't think it's difficult to do that. Several times this would be easy to do, but people don't actually think through it enough to try create this relative advantage, but it's extremely important in successful adoption to create this impression of relative advantage over what has gone before. Observability image is an interesting one in terms of open source because it's downplayed. So many open source products are designed to be as similar as possible to proprietary counterparts. So you can't really tell if someone is using, Impress or PowerPoint, or like the spreadsheet and the word processing are more or less identical. And also some organizations, if you want to create the impression that open source software is not a big deal to deploy, then you're probably going to downplay the differences. So it's not so obvious. But image this was where Rogers assumed that new technology is almost always seen as a positive image. People want the latest iPhone or the latest whatever technology, latest Android. But it's not necessarily the case. So this is a quote from someone that they thought the view in the organization, this organization, was that open source software is poor man's Microsoft. It's from Jurassic Park. So it was seen as a really old-fashioned, antiquated code base, whereas in fact the code base was much newer than what was in the Microsoft product, but people didn't see it that way. They saw it as a negative thing. And you really need to create, like Extremadura in Spain was a great example of creating a positive image around open source software. You know, tailored to the region, people wanted it, did things that couldn't do before. So you really need to, don't assume the technical people almost always underestimate this. They think, well, everyone will see the positive image here and everyone want to use it. And in reality, there are lots of people who don't see it that way. So you need to take that into account. Trialability is, yeah, again, most open source software is very interesting in salespeople, the prospects versus suspects that happens in the same sales terminology. You know, normally there's a high ratio. People who come to a proprietary company to buy something, they don't convert to buy, you know, the ratio between those who come to ask questions and those who actually buy something is quite a high ratio. And in open source context, it's much lower because people have almost always tried out the technology themselves. When they come to deploy it or to hire a company to help deploy it, they've already more or less made the decision. So trialability is very, very much facilitated in the open source context. Again, the idea here is if people can try it out at home, that leads to a positive image, it leads to better training and so on. But trialability, again, you don't want, some organizations assume, well, people have downloaded the software and they've tried it out, so they've been trained. You don't want to assume because people can download a free copy that they've been trained in how to use it. So that's going to be a recipe for failure if you underestimate that. Compatibility is an interesting thing. So compatibility was the idea that this would be compatible with how people want to work. So Massachusetts, which was the state of Massachusetts, were the first in the world to mandate open standards, open data format for documents. They made and it's acknowledged by Peter Quinn, who got lots of bad press in the meantime, but they had a critical flaw in that the open office version they moved to didn't have disability support. Disability support is often provided by third-party vendors who will provide it for the dominant platform, basically. So it was available in the Microsoft Office offering. It wasn't available in the open office offering initially. And it was a huge mistake. It was a small number of people, but everyone can empathize with if disabled users can no longer communicate with the government because the technology doesn't support their needs. It was a small thing, but it was a critical thing to get wrong. So that created such a bad impression that it really colored people's views. Another problem I would say is open office Impress. Well, the PowerPoint equivalent was buggy, I guess, in the early days and problematic. And it is interesting if you know, it's often related that the greatest fear people have in life is they fear public speaking more than they fear being dead, for example. If people rate the things they fear most, a lot of people choose public speaking as a higher fear than actually dying. I don't know how that means if you're giving a eulogy at a funeral, but I think I'd prefer not to be dead. But people have a real dread of public speaking. So what you don't want, if you've got some software that supports public speaking like Impress or PowerPoint, you don't want that to be the one that goes wrong. So I remember about 10 years ago more, I guess, about 10 years ago, or a little more maybe, I saw a person, we were talking about, he was talking about the open source adoption in his organization, and he got up to talk to a Linux users group, very like this one actually, but probably more people, a few hundred people, because it was seen as very, very groundbreaking at the time. And he was going to present in Impress, and it crashed, and he couldn't present. And I would say that was hugely negative. There were 300 people in the room who felt for him and said, well, if I'm going to give a talk, I don't want my presentation to crash. I guess if this crashed, it's PDF as well, but you don't want that to be where your failure point is. So people, there are people, I deal with a lot of students, and they often lose their theses using Microsoft Word, you know, but everyone can relate. Even people, interestingly, that story about the person who, the guy who was talking at a technical conference and his Impress presentation failed. I heard that story, you know, 5 or 6 years later. people would relate that story who are users who never had to give a public presentation in their life, and never used PowerPoint or Impress, but they would relate that story with horror about, well, if you're using open source software, you could have this kind of problem might happen to you. So you don't want your, there are things that you don't want to get wrong, I guess, and people can empathize with someone public speaking, the presentation software fails. So you, again, the critical thing is that disabled users are clearly people who should get extra support, not be disadvantaged by new technology. So that was a real chink that they were ignored basically by the Massachusetts the committee, actually, the IT group. They just ignored them, and it was the wrong thing to do. And they acknowledged afterwards that was a completely wrong thing to do, but it did have a huge impact. So again, be aware that if you're going to deploy something, it's new technology. Often with new technology, if it was a proprietary software has been implemented, there wouldn't necessarily be disability support in it, because that happens later when third-party vendors add it. But you don't want, in an open source context, to give any ammunition to people who will be critical. Absorptive capacity relates to, does the organization have knowledge to implement open source software? That was a big issue in the past, I would say. I think it's far less so now. There are certain, all graduates now, university students just use open source software because they can download it free. So there's lots of expertise out there. It's much more easy to get people open source expertise now than it was 15 years ago. I think you do need technical competence to solve some of the problems, but you do need that with any new technology. And local software companies often are the key here, I think. That's one of the things we've found, that a small software company can be the key to provide the knowledge necessary for the organization. This is a quote here: "The exhilarating succession of problem-solving challenges when installing open source software." So this is actually a quote from, it's from the mid-90s, I think, or maybe late 90s. It was an engineer educated at MIT in Boston, so one of the best educated engineers in the world, but he wrote a blog about installing Linux, and he said it took him 17 hours, but it was the most exhilarating succession of problem-solving challenges that he had faced. And that is not what people want. Many technical people enjoy that challenge. Most managers and most users and organizations don't get their kicks from technology installation. So you need to have this working properly. So it can't be like they want the wizard that works right out of the box. You don't want any kind of challenge in that way. So that's important as well, to make sure you have that you can configure, install error-free or without any exhilarating problem-solving challenges. The attitude to innovation and risk I've mentioned as well. So some organizations want to be seen as progressive and innovative, and they like to do new things. So this is a big one in the state of Massachusetts. They were the first government in the world, they claim, to mandate open standards. I think it's true. I haven't seen anyone. Lots of people were doing it, but they mandated it. But they also, it was building a tradition. They're the first to create a public library, a public school, a public subway. So they saw themselves as progressive and go ahead, and they wanted to do new things, and new technology was seen as being something that would create or extend or sustain that innovative image for the organization. Okay, so I'm getting to the end. So these are some of the key lessons. Identify management champions who will be high-powered people, high-profile people in the organization who will support the adoption of open source. Use local software companies. So this, I think, is really important, to build an ecosystem to get to support, to get your local companies involved, because they will be the people who will tailor it. They will be the people who will do the problem solving, will do the knowledge gathering and so on. Avoid any opt-out groups forming who become elite, who are seen as, well, they didn't have to adopt open source software because they were the chosen ones and they were the special ones. Provide good, tailored, multi-phase training. So use that to upskill users, use it to identify the advantages of open source. And don't assume that it's just 3 days training at the start. You have training at different levels, at different times, at different phases. And try to create a positive image of open source. That is not something you can take for granted. So there's no doubt about it. There is companies have been successful, some have not been, and it's been success in some products, not in others. So you can't take it for granted, but there is no reason now why a company cannot be successful in deploying open source software. And it's by identifying some of these things or these issues is going to be what will ensure success. So I'm pretty much ready to wrap up. Let me just finish here with two things. So I've been involved in open source software for about 15 years maybe, or something like that. These are quotes from 1998. So Bob Metcalfe is the man who created Ethernet and founded the company 3Com. So he's retired a multi-billionaire. But in 1998 he made the claim that he gives salons in Boston, I guess, so he's very influential in technology circles. But he said open source software is just utopian balderdash. It's not going to survive. Ken Thompson, one of the creators of Unix, had a look at Linux, and he said, well, Linux is not going to be very successful in the long run. I've looked at the code, I don't like it. So these are two giants in the technology field. And when I was coming back to prepare this talk, I've been giving it some talks over the past year or so, I saw these quotes again, because I remember in 1998 seeing these quotes and thinking, okay, that's pretty significant. If these two guys think open source software isn't going anywhere, that's something to bear in mind. I think now they're both wrong, certainly. The open source software has been hugely successful. It is the success story of, there are so many things enabled by it. So it's been so both those guys who are giants in their field and in many years of technology were wrong when it came to open source software. It is certainly more viable now and becomes more viable every day. So my message is clearly a positive message. I'm part of the persuaded that there's no reason why in any sector you shouldn't. There are many, many compelling reasons to adopt open source and very few negatives. Okay, so that's pretty much it. This is the shameless plug time. So we have a book on the on this which gives more detail on the lessons learned. So it's published. It's the 5 case studies I mentioned in different countries with myself and some co-authors. It's published by MIT Press, who are a good publisher. But the interesting thing is their model is to they sell books. So they're a non-profit organization, but they sell books. And that's their primary goal. So when they do a book, they sell it for about 9 months or so, and then they release it under MIT's Creative Commons license, so you can download it free. So this book should be coming out soon under that Creative Commons, so it should be available to download free. And I remember thinking they did this for the book we did before, and I thought that was very noble. That was MIT abiding or supporting the Creative Commons. And they told me, no, it's nothing to do with that. We're about creating value for our shareholders. We find that if we sell a book initially, then there are people who buy the book because they can't get it anywhere else. And if you create a free version 9 months or so later, it juices up and energizes the brand again. So people will download it and read it, and other people, observability, other people will see them reading it and say, what's that? And they'll come back. It boosts sales of the book again. So they do it to boost sales. It gives it an extra injection of sales. So I would recommend that you all download this book free, and that will generate sales for the book as well. So thank you very much. That's all I have to say. I'm happy. I think we've got some time for questions, I guess. I'm happy to take questions on any of that.
Yes, thank you very much. Some questions?
You were talking generally about adoption of Unix, but I would like to hear if you have some personal experience with that.
I would say that it wasn't Linux only. So it was. I would say that a lot of that was personal experience. So but it wasn't technical lessons, because I don't think they're the interesting ones. So there were all kinds of, like if you look at a timeline of adoption where there were problems, sometimes problems were solved by a new version of the open source software, but it was too late because the organization had lost faith in it. So I don't know what you mean by personal, because this is very personal to me. But okay, so well, it is intended to be personal. So it is very. it is very frustrating, for example, when a chief executive says, well, we want to deploy open source software in this organization, but I'm not going to do it, you know. So it's hard then, like you immediately see, well, that's going to be a problem for the rest of the organization if he and some others in his level can opt out. So they're kinds of personal, it's all based on personal experience, you know. So, but it isn't, I've tried to, well, maybe the way I've presented, I try to generalize the lessons because I feel that's more important. There's no point in, if it's too specific, then the danger is that people would say, well, that only applied in that case to that person, that context. Whereas I'm trying to get back to more high-level lessons, and the framework is intended to bring those lessons back to high-level lessons about technology adoption more generally.
Any advice on when you have resistance in adopting open source software? Any advice how to deal with that when there is a group which is resisting and would want to opt out?
Sure. The one, assume it's going to happen. So don't, like, people sometimes think, well, who could object to this? It's free and it's saving money, and so what you need to do is to counter, like what I think often happens is, like I mentioned it, for example, people 5 years later were complaining about Impress failing at a presentation 5 years earlier, but they would never use Impress in their life, or complaining that that CLUC, for example, had, you know, the limit in CLUC in the early days in the spreadsheet was 65,536 cells or whatever, or rows, and people complain, well, I couldn't move to a spreadsheet that only had 65,000 rows. You know, they were never using a spreadsheet with 65,000 rows in their life, but they were using that kind of, what they would do is generalize, maybe this is going back to your point, they would generalize that to, well, open source software doesn't work as well because Impress crashes and CLUC doesn't support as many rows as Excel. You know, it didn't at the time maybe. So these were false kind of technical reasons being given. So what you need to do is to debate with the opt-out group and see where they're coming from. So, like what in the organization I mentioned, for example, they thought, well, we'll make deployment, one organization where the consultant's a hospital, we'll make adoption of open source mandatory, and people won't be able to opt out because we won't give them technical support. Now, the two groups that opted out were top management. So if your chief executive, his computer isn't working in the morning, you're not going to tell him, well, I don't give you any technical support. So that was not going to work in that case. And the consultants got around that by saying, we don't need it. We have enough money to hire our own technical support. And that's a disaster in organizations. If you've got several IT departments, you know, the IT governance data is going to be a nightmare because they'll bring in their own independent IT consultant who will deploy technology all over the place. So it's a recipe for disaster. So you need to look at the configuration of that opt-out group and try to understand why they're opting out. The consultants were opting out because they felt this is too much hassle. So what you need then was to provide, show them the advantages. There were advantages in terms of streaming X-ray images around the hospital and so on that should have been sold better, I think. So what you're trying to do is to deconstruct the opt-out argument, the opt-out group's arguments, and show where, well, because you should treat it as serious. If the opt-out group are genuine and have a problem, then you have to counter that problem. So assume it's going to happen and engage with that opt-out group and try to ensure that they're not spreading erroneous messages, because that's what often tends to happen. People, they take these messages and it loses something in the translation. It becomes a rumor then in the rest of the organization. So I hope that's what you do. There were clear cases where that happened with the consultants, with the disabled users who were ignored by the IT group in Massachusetts. That was such a bad mistake to make, in retrospect. But they were plowing ahead. Mitt Romney was the governor who may be the next president of the US. He was the governor who plowed ahead when Microsoft tried to stop it. He insisted on going ahead with it. So he had lots of support because he saw it as innovative. But make sure that you engage with the group so they don't become something bigger later.
So you mentioned OpenOffice and Impress a couple of times.
Yeah.
I've been wondering, what's your opinion on visual appeal of those applications? Does it add to the perception that the open source applications are some kind of a punishment or a degradation?
Well, I think they do things differently. The problem is a lot of people complain, that spell check and various things are different. They're just different in Microsoft and OpenOffice, for example. None is right or wrong, basically. Just because it's in a different menu doesn't mean anything. But you'd be surprised how unfamiliarity, people think that's a bug because they can't find what they normally found. They see it as a bug. I think open source software has often thrown up innovations. It does things more cleverly, but it does things differently. Maybe the way cells, in multi-language, the way cells split differs between Calc and Excel, and there are things that people don't expect. You have to take into account. But generally, I would say, like OpenOffice had Irish translation before, so they often have translate new languages before. They have new features that the proprietary companies learn from and put into their software. So that's good for the consumer, because anything that's an advantage, it should be in both platforms. So I would say, what you're comparing as well. The interesting thing I think is that the versions of this is about 10 or 12 years ago as well. Some of this, and the versions of OpenOffice, there were problems that were technical problems that were solved in the next release, but because it had done the damage that people had their mind was made up that this was not useful for them. But what you were comparing often is a code base, a proprietary code base that was stable and around for 12, 15 years maybe, with a kind of beta version, if you like, sometimes in the open source world. And it was an unfair comparison because things hadn't been ironed out. So if you're comparing code bases that are the same age, I think you will find that the open source versions they're at least as good quality as proprietary versions, at least as good. I don't think they're uniformly better, that some people complain, but they're no worse, I would say. So I think that issue is largely gone. The user interface is as good, if not better, in open source products now, I would say. The interesting thing I think would be, if you were to move people back, which should start to happen, we would say, if you had to move people back from open source to proprietary. I didn't study this, but I knew it was happening in one context, and I was interested in going back to look at that to see if people would be complaining, because they got used to open source, and all of a sudden they found, well, hang on, this menu doesn't work the way I expected. This new software is crap. That would be interesting, because it was seen going the other way, so it should happen both ways. Yes. Well, I think the ideas that have come from it, new modes of organizing, so open innovation, for example, crowdsourcing, those have solved big societal problems. So outside software, they have been successful. Like the Creative Commons, I guess, came about. The GPL, all rights reversed. Like that. It is an exemplar. I think that's been the biggest impact. Is that if you were to tell people, if you were to go back to 1992 and say to people, well, Microsoft, who outgunned IBM and out-strategized IBM in the PC world, or in the PC operating system world, if you were to say, well, the threat to Microsoft might come from a Finnish university student using software developed in a voluntary way, that would be seen as ludicrous. So it has scaled. It has scaled to be a successful exemplar of cooperative work. So open science, like the implications are, in law, for example, the whole IP issues are looked at differently. In science, lots of the National Science Foundation in the US now is doing lots of crowd science or open science projects. NASA are doing it. Now people believe the wisdom of crowds, that you can actually do certain things. Problems that organizations can't solve can be solved by going to the crowd, or going to the, going open. Open innovation as well, that you can get people working outside the organization. So all those kinds of things, global software development specifically has learned things about how you run open source projects. So it has huge implications as a mode of organizing and as a mode of innovation, I would say. That's where its real payoff is, not in the technical side so much, but the idea that you can harness usefully a global community. I think that couldn't have happened at any other time in history, you see. So it was, the time was right, and it was not expected. And if you were to try in a theoretical way to say, well, such and such a movement can happen now because the internet exists, people wouldn't have believed it. It had to actually happen, and then you got people in other disciplines to take notice and to say this is a serious phenomenon, we should try to emulate this. So its major implications, I would say, are outside the software domain to how people organize now. Organizations think very differently because of it. You know?
You mentioned open source clusters of small companies that bid on large projects with that bid against proprietary software. Have you noticed any difference in business approach between open source clusters and proprietary software solutions?
Yes, the governance is different. So, you know, like everyone knows how to run a large organization pretty much. But in an open source service network, what you have really are small companies who are also competitors. They collaborate to do things, but they also compete with each other. So it's very fluid and dynamic. How you exercise sanctions in that group is very interesting, because if people behave badly, it's peer pressure basically. You know, they get a bad reputation, and that's very effective. So there are things that organizations think, you know, the organizations assume that won't work as well, whereas in an open source service network, collective sanctions, if the other people expel a member and so on, or criticize a member, that's a very powerful message. So it's just the way they operate differently. What they can provide is different as well. I think they can really provide a very tailored service, because it's every one of those. The interesting thing is that IBM is a juggernaut, a huge lorry. It's hard to change direction. Like when they developed the IBM PC in 1981, they took a division out of IBM and sent them down to Florida and shut them up in a warehouse basically to develop the PC, so they could do it in 9 months, because it could never have happened in the traditional IBM project structure. What this open source service network gives you is each of the components is nimble and agile, and the network is nimble and agile as well. So when the requirements from the client change a little bit, that was a big deal for IBM to try reconfigure and bring in new consultants to respond to that. The open source service network could change overnight. They could say, oh, you need so-and-so, that's the person we need to bring to the next meeting, and that's the person. So they were much more flexible about about responding to customer changes and customer modifications. So it was great to see it, actually, because I think that is the future, small groups coming together in a nimble, agile way.
I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions. What do you think about software developers which are actually developing open source distros about their extremes? I won't mention exactly who, but one of them said that we have to lead, we have to dominate, and open source is going to be the main one day. That's actually an extreme that wouldn't be good. What do you think about that?
Okay, I'm a pragmatist, I guess. So I've always been looking at open source. I decided that lots of people are looking in at the phenomenon to see, well, this is a surprise. How does it work when people aren't being paid, and how are they dividing up the work and so on? I was always interested. I'm very quickly interested in saying, well, it does work. So let's look outwards at what are the implications for society or for organizations or for the software industry if you look out at it and just take for granted it works. I would say that I ran a few EU projects, for example, where we had developers who would, like, it was a nightmare to coordinate a project, for example. So what you had was, we generally had a mix of companies and individuals from companies and people from the Free Software Foundation Europe, for example, and various ambassador organizations. And what you tended to have to do was you would have to send out maybe 3 versions of every document. So you would have to have, well, 3 was useful. So if you sent out, say, and it varied. So if you sent out a PDF, which is acceptable to most people, some people would come back and say, well, PDF isn't really, it's not open source. So you'd have to have an open office created document, PDF, or at least that, open office and PDF. But then other people want to make changes, for example. So you'd have to, and there were lots of people in organizations who, even though it was an open source project, they only had Microsoft Office, for example. So you had to send out a Microsoft Office version, an open office version, and a PDF version of the documents, and get changes back to each of the formats, and people would resent, they would send a mail to 1,000 others and copy 1,000 other people saying, well, what's this, you're an open source project and you haven't sent us an open source document format, So the zealots, I think there are lots of them. Like, I was at a keynote talk in Istanbul a few years ago where one of the keynote speakers said he wouldn't talk. Well, he inspected the bottle of water on the podium first, and he said, okay, he said, I'll drink this. He said, I thought it might be one of Dacia, and he said, which is sponsored by Coca-Cola, and I don't drink anything sponsored by Coca-Cola. So he was checking the local water. He also went around to all the posters and insisted that OSS was the wrong term, that it should be FOSS. And he wouldn't talk until they had been corrected. So it is interesting, because there are a lot of people for whom that is I think there are people who think their role in history has been undermined if they don't get full credit. So, and it's like there are lots of groups who like being. I certainly know this, that there are people who dislike the popularity of open source free software because it's become mainstream, and it's no longer a badge of. It's not the same thing once that happens. And to be honest, the term was coined in 1998 to become more mainstream, and they succeeded fabulously. So we wouldn't be here today. This would be interesting, I think. Free software is a term that's been around for a long time, at least 1985, you could say, but earlier. And if the term open source hadn't been coined in 1998, we would not have this convention today, I would say, because it wasn't really going anywhere. Open source it created a new debate, and it got industry involved very cleverly, and that's why we have these conventions today. That's why you have the list of sponsors you have earlier. So all those things happened because it became mainstream. So it'd be a completely different phenomenon if that hadn't happened. So in a way, the question is, you can't really answer it, because the people who complain, or if they had their way, then it would be a different phenomenon. I know that's sorry, you had 2 questions, and that's a long-winded answer to one of them, maybe.
That was pretty great answer. Well, my first question was actually connected with somebody who wants to dominate with one distro, like Microsoft, like that.
Okay. Okay. But that's human nature, I suppose. There are lots of databases out there, and they all compete. Competition is good. So competition is good for the consumer.
Yes.
So I think it would be bad if there was only one distro. That's not necessarily a good thing in any sphere of life. So I would tend not to support that anyway.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, considering our ministry, we heard the panel earlier, and our minister said that he doesn't have some clear strategy goals.
Yes.
How to adopt this open source. But what message would you give him? From which point he should start?
Well, there are enough experiences out there now in Europe, that you go to your, like in the past it was more difficult to find an industry sector that was identical to you that had done it. Now you can do that. So you can go to another ministry, whichever ministry in several countries who are like you, and you can say, okay, how did you get on? What worked and what didn't work? So it's not as if you have to, you can find exemplars that are successful. There are lots of people out there who know how to do this now, and you can find organizations, software organizations, to support you to do it locally, I think. So I think that's what you need to do. Actually interesting, I suppose, it shows the panel discussion was, Ivan kindly offered to have someone translate for me, but I guess it would have been awkward if they were sitting in the front, so Esperanto didn't take off, I guess. And I'm talking to you in English, so open formats for language are, I didn't get most of the panel, but I heard a lot of the laughing. So your question, the advice to the ministry is like events like this. Like if I was in the ministry, when I looked at when we were developing open source software, deploying it in 2000, and so around 2000, you couldn't get a group of administrators and a group of groups this size really to come together. At that time, a few years later, you could. So now you've got support. It's not so lonely a journey as it was in the past, I think. So I can't see any reason. And the reasons not to adopt, like those reasons I have up there to adopt open source, some of those are very compelling. And the people now know the advantage. Like in the past, we had an EU project once which was about open source software and open data standards. I thought the open data standards was much more important. I couldn't get anyone else to, not real, like you could get the people in the project could see that, but the reviewers, most industry at the time, they were interested in the open source software part. They weren't interested in the open data standards part. And like they go together, I guess, but open data standards is much more important, I guess. So that kind of awareness is there now that wasn't there in the past, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is no other questions. Well, thank you very much, Brian Fitzgerald. Here is your little gift for you. Vani ima knjiga na pultu, pa možete pogledati knjigu ovu koju je predstavio. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Sada